Welcome back. We're going to look at section 2.1, categorical variables. You can see from the outline that we just have two things to talk about. We're going to look at one categorical variable and study its associated counts and proportions. And then we'll study two categorical variables, and I'll show you how to work with pairs of categorical variables, and in particular how to build and interpret a two-way table. All right, so the very first thing we're going to want to do is work with counts and proportions. An easy way to get started thinking about counts and proportions is just to have StatKey do a lot of the work for us. Let's take a look. I want us to study a file, a set of data organized in a file called Student Survey Award Preferences. Let me give you a brief description of what that file contains. So a group of students, college-age students, was asked, which award would you most want? An Academy Award, a Nobel Prize, or an Olympic medal? And so each student in this data set represents a row, and there's a single column, and that's the award that they prefer. And so what you're going to see in this data set is just row after row of either the Nobel Prize, the Academy Award, or the Olympic medal, depending upon which of those three that particular student selected. So it's a very simple data file. What StatKey can do for us is very quickly go through that file and summarize and present that data to us. It's going to present it to us graphically and summarized within a table. Okay, so I'll show you how to get that file into StatKey. But what I want us, and we'll kind of study how that data is being presented to us, but I want us to come back then at the end and make sure that we answer these four questions. So how many students are in the survey? How many students want the Nobel Prize? What proportion of the students want the Academy Award? And which award has the highest count? All right, so we want to make sure we answer those four questions before we're done. All right, now let's go to StatKey. Now we're working with a single categorical variable, and we're just trying to describe that single categorical variable. So we're going to be in this section, this basic section over here called Descriptive Statistics and Graphs, one categorical variable. So we'll click on that, and then we'll go over here and load the file called Student Survey Award Preference. Okay. Once we load that file, we can take a look at the file. I'm going to show you the data table. You can see, just as we suspected, right, every single row corresponds to a student that was in the survey, and there's one column called award, and what we're seeing is, for example, student 1 chose the Olympic medal, student 2 chose the Academy Award, and student 3 chose the Nobel Prize, etc., etc. Now, StatKey does a lot of the grunt work for us. It goes through and it just summarizes everything for us. The easiest way to get into this is just to go over to the table of summary statistics, and very quickly you can see that there were 362 total students involved in the survey, and their choices, the counts for their choices, are shown here in the column labeled count. So 182 chose the Olympic medal, 31 chose the Academy Award, and 149 chose the Nobel Prize. Now, another way to look at those that same bit of data is to look at it through the lens of proportion. So all we have to do is take the 182 that chose the Olympic medal, divide that by the 362 total students in the survey, and we can see that the proportion that chose the Olympic medal was 0.503, or about 50.3% of the students chose the Olympic medal. And then you can do that same calculation for the Academy Award and the Nobel Prize. So everything we would want to know about this single categorical variable called award is in the summary statistics here. Now, another way of looking at that same data is graphically using this bar chart. So basically all you have to do is list the values of your categorical variable here on the x-axis, so Olympic medal, Academy Award, and Nobel Prize, and then have a scale off to the side, and then draw a bar whose height is exactly the count in question. So for the Olympic medal, we're going to have to draw a bar that's 182 units high. And according to our scale, that looks about right, because here's 175, and it's just a little bit higher than that 175. So one of the defects, of course, on a bar chart is it's going to be hard to get an exact count from the bar chart, but we can get a rough ballpark idea that the number of students that chose this Olympic medal was more than 175, and we can probably ballpark it at around 180. Now, one of the virtues, though, of course, of the bar chart, and one of the reasons why it gets used frequently, is because it's fantastic at kind of very quickly allowing us to just look at the data and realize without too much work that regardless of what the exact counts are, the Olympic medal is certainly the most favored, followed by the Nobel Prize, followed by the Academy Award. All right, so that's one of the virtues of this graphical illustration, is you can just very quickly look at the data and see that, yeah, most of the students are the largest choice was for the Olympic medal, followed by the Nobel Prize, followed by the Academy Award. So that's the beauty of the bar chart. Okay, now let's remember the 4 questions that we were going to try to answer, right? How many students are in the survey? That's easily obtained here in this total. It's 362. How many students want the Nobel Prize? That's pretty straightforward. We can see that that's the 149. What proportion of the students want the Academy Award? Well, it's asking us for the proportion, so we're going to report the answer of 0.086. And which award has the highest count? We can either get that graphically or we can get it from our counts table. But no matter how you cut it, no matter how you look at it, it's the Olympic medal. That was the one that had the highest count. All right. Now, let's go back to our main file here. And what I want to do here, just to kind of close out this first subsection, is just to make sure that we are aware of the notation that's typically used for proportions, and look at a very simple problem just to kind of get comfortable with that notation. All right, so let A denote some attribute within a population. All right, you can think very broadly in that, right? So the attribute could be has blue eyes or has brown eyes or whatever. Okay, so there's some attribute within a population that you're interested in. Okay, let a sample be drawn from the population. So we're imagining the population, and then we're imagining going in and circling or casting a net and pulling out a sample from that larger population. All right, the proportion of the population that has attribute A is denoted by simply P for proportion. The proportion of the sample that has attribute A is denoted by P hat. And we really do want to make sure we use this notation very, very wisely, right? So when we're dealing with a population proportion, we're going to use P, and when we're dealing with a sample proportion, we'll use P hat. All right. Now, here's where we're going with this, of course, right? In principle, most of the time, we're really interested in knowing the value of P. We want to know what's happening in the population. But as we know, those populations can be large and they can be hard to survey an entire population. And so what we do is we grab a sample from the population, we set it aside, we query the sample, and we develop P hat. We get a proportion of attribute A within the sample. And then we use inferential statistics, and we hope that the value of P hat is very, very close to the value of P. So we can use the value P hat to estimate the value of P. Now, that's going to rely on having a large enough sample, and it's going to rely on really having a representative sample. So using good sampling procedures, using good randomization methods to pull that sample out of the population. But that's the goal. Now let's take a look at a very simple problem just to kind of get comfortable with this notation and make sure that we're using the notation correctly, right? So a player is dealt a hand of 6 cards from a standard deck of cards. We're going to take a look at the picture below in just a second. Using proper notation, express the proportion of red cards in the population and the proportion of red cards in the sample. Okay, so when we're thinking about this hand of cards, we're imagining that it's coming from a standard deck of cards, which is a set of 52 cards, 26 of which are red and 26 of which are black. So what is the proportion of red cards in the population or within the deck of cards? It's going to be 26 out of 52 or 0.5. Now, we've extracted the set of 6 cards from that deck of cards, and so now we can ask what's the proportion of red cards in that sample? And here the answer is going to be somewhat different, right? We're going to have 1, 2, 3, 4 red cards out of a set of 6 cards. That's 4 out of 6 or 2 out of 3 or 0.66. So we would say p hat equals 0.66. So p equals 0.5, but p hat equals 0.66. So just to summarize that, our answer would consist of, for the population, for the deck of cards, p equals 0.5. For the sample, for the hand of cards that we were dealt, p hat equals 0.66. Okay, so that is kind of all I wanted to say on working with a single categorical variable. We want to know something about counts. We want to know something about proportions. We saw how we could load a file into StatKey and have it do some of this kind of grunt work for us. So our next task is to go and study working with 2 categorical variables at a time. So we're now going to move on to studying 2 categorical variables. Now, as before, an easy way to get started thinking about 2 categorical variables is to let StatKey do a lot of the grunt work for us. So we're going to concentrate on loading a file into StatKey, having it summarize the statistics for us, and then what we'll do is we'll spend some time thinking about how we can pull the information that we want out of those summary statistics. So the particular file we're interested in is called Student Survey Smoking by Gender. And in this case, each student in the survey was asked 2 different questions. We were trying to seek answers to 2 different attributes. Do you smoke, yes or no? And what is your gender, male or female? All right, so what we have to imagine is the data set's going to look like a spreadsheet where every row is a student, and there are 2 columns. The first column, let's say, is answering the question about smoking, and the second question is answering the question about your gender. Okay, so let's go ahead, go to StatKey, and load that file in. Oh, before we do that, though, let's take a look at the kind of questions that we want to pull out of this data set, right? So how many students are in the survey? How many female students are smokers? How many students are not smokers? What proportion of the males are smokers? What proportion of the students are males that smoke? And then we're going to switch variables. You'll see there's a little button that we can hit to switch the variables, and we're going to ask ourselves, why might that be useful to switch the variables? What is it doing? Why might that be a useful thing to do? Okay, so we're going to go and get StatKey started here, and we're working in descriptive statistics, 2 categorical variables, and the file we're interested in is Student Survey Smoking by Gender. Again, let's take a look at the data table just so that we can kind of get comfortable here. As we suspected, we've got a bunch of rows, 1 row for each student. Those are our cases. We've got 2 variables of interest, 2 categorical variables. One is called gender, male or female, and smoking, yes, no. All right, so for every single student in the survey, we're going to have responses for each of those categorical variables, all right? Okay, now let's take a look at the kind of information that StatKey presents to us right off the bat, all right? So notice what StatKey is going to do here. Let's go to this counts table. It's going to take the 362 students that are in the population that was surveyed, and it's going to break them up according to rows and also according to columns. Let's take a look at the rows first. The rows represent gender, male or female. And let's look at the totals. There's 193 males in the survey and 169 females in the survey, and those are adding up to the total of 362. So those give us the totals just for that single categorical variable, male or female. The columns are addressing smoking, yes or no, and we can see that 319 of the students said they do not smoke, and 43 said that they do smoke, and again, those numbers add up to 362. So that's kind of the information that's in the margins here, and those reflect the totals for those categorical variables just taken by themselves. Now, if we go to the inner part of the table here, this inside bit, these are the counts for looking at the two characteristics simultaneously. So for instance, if we want to know how many males do not smoke, that's reported here in this cell. That's the 166 males that do not smoke. If we look at these 16 here, those represent the females that do smoke. So we have that cross information contained within these cells here. Okay, now what about the graphic representation of this information? So you have to pay special attention here. The x-axis is labeled smoke and the y-axis is labeled gender. And the default here is to take all of the students that said no to smoking and represent that as one giant bar, okay? And that bar has height. We can go back over here. That's that 319 that we're seeing here. The height of this bar is the 319 students that do not smoke. And what StatKey does is it splits the bar into a lower half and an upper half according to whether you're a male that doesn't smoke or you're a female that doesn't smoke. So the brown is representing the men and the blue is representing the female. The same thing with the yes, right? It's a much shorter stack because there's only 43 students that smoke. And those 43 are divided into the male cohort, which is 27, and the female cohort, which is 16, giving us the total of 43. So right away, you can kind of see very quickly just by looking at the heights of the bars that there are many, many more non-smokers than smokers. And then we can see how these bars, the non-smokers and the smokers, are divided amongst themselves into males and females by looking at the relative heights of the colored subsections within those bars. Okay, so that's a description of, again, what the data set looks like to start with, and then how that data set is brought into StatKey and summarized in a table and graphically. Okay, now let's go to some of those questions, right? How many students are in the survey? That's our total here. That's the 362 that we're seeing here, right? How many female students are smokers? How many female students are smokers? So we want to find the female students that have answered yes to smoking, and that's the 16 that we're seeing there. There are 16 females that are smokers. How many students are not smokers? How many students said no to smoking? That's the 319 that we're seeing here. So we can get that count simply by looking at the margin here. All right. What proportion of the males are smokers? Now I'm going to show you how to do this in a couple of different ways. First, we're going to do it just by looking at this table, and then I'll show you how we can use StatKey's built-in proportion calculators. But I think it's easier at this point just to concentrate on getting the information out of this table and just doing the calculation ourselves. Okay, so what proportion of the males are smokers? What proportion of the males are smokers? So we go to our male category. So what proportion of the males? So we're saying of the males, that's going to be a denominator of 193. Of those 193 that are males, how many of them are smokers, right? That's 27. So 27 out of the 193 are smokers. Now, what is that proportion? Well, we're going to go to the Desmo scientific calculator. We've got 27 of the 193 males are smokers, and that's going to give us a proportion of 0.139. Let's just call it 0.14. All right, so that's the proportion of males that are smokers. Okay, next question. What proportion of the students are males that smoke? What proportion of the students are males that smoke? Now, by the way the question is being asked, what proportion of the students? We know that the students are going to form the denominator. That's going to be the 362. All right, so we're going to have 362 in the denominator. What proportion of the students are males that smoke? Well, we're going to look for males that are smokers, and there's that 27. So there's 27 students that are males that smoke, and that's going to be out of the 362 total students. So we're going to do a calculation just as before. But now we're going to have the 27 students now out of the total of 362 students. And that's going to give us the proportion 0.075. Okay, 0.075. Okay, and then we wanted to know what happens when we hit the switch variables and why is this useful? Now, before we do that, I don't want to get too far ahead of myself. Let's see how StatKey could have done some of the same calculations we just carried out. So it gives us the option of looking at these proportions through rows, columns, or overall. Let's click on row first and see what's going on here. All right, so we're seeing that the males, right, are divided into a 0.86 that do not smoke and then the 0.14 that do smoke. This is that first calculation that we did. That's the 27. That's the 27 out of the 193. So there's that 0.14 that we calculated initially. All right, so each of these cells represents a proportion that's being calculated within a row. So the males are being divided into non-smokers and smokers, and those are the proportions within the group of males. And within the females, we've got the non-smokers and the smokers. And that's the information we get when we click on row. We get a similar behavior when we click on column. So now we're basically saying take all of the non-smokers and calculate the proportions that are male and the proportions that are female. Take the smokers and divide them into the proportion that are male and in the proportion that are female. Okay, and then there's the overall. Okay, and basically when you're doing the overall calculation, you have to imagine going up into this table here, and each of these four values is being you're finding the proportion of each of those four values within the total of the 362. So if you remember, one of the calculations we did is we said, what proportion of the students are males that smoke? We said the males that smoke are these 27, and we wanted to know what proportion were they out of the 362. That's that 0.075 that we calculated. That's the 27 out of 362 that we've already calculated. So we can kind of use our common sense and just work from the counts table, or we can use StatKey's built-in proportions subtable here. All right, either way we can get the answers that we want. Now, let's address this final part of the set of questions. What happens when we click on switch variables? We're going to see it most notably in the graphic display, but we'll also see it here in this counts table. Let's hit switch variables. And you'll notice what it does, and this is technically called a transposition. It's basically turning the old columns into the rows and turning the old rows into the columns. And so now we see the gender category here forming the columns, and we can see the smoking category forming the rows. Now, it's most noticeable when we look at it from the point of view of the graphical display. Here now we have gender on the x-axis, and here we have smoking on the y-axis. And so now what we're seeing is we're seeing all of the males together into one giant bar, and we're seeing all of the females together into one giant bar. And now these bars are being divided into the non-smoking portion and the smoking portion. So as we pass from the brown to the blue, we're going from non-smoking to smoking, non-smoking to smoking. Okay, so why might it be useful to switch the variables? Well, it might be especially useful in this graphical display if we're really interested in primarily how the genders are dividing themselves, for instance, among smoking and non-smoking. We can kind of see very quickly here that the males are divided between non-smokers and smokers in this way, and the females between non-smokers and smokers in this manner. So it's just another way of looking at the data through slicing the data, in this case, first by genders, and then within those categories by smoking and non-smoking. At any rate, no matter how you do it, you can kind of look at the data in both ways, right? You can use switch variables to allow you to kind of transpose the information, all right? All right, so the next thing we're going to do is build a two-way table from some partial information. Let's take a look at the context. So here's some information concerning half marathon and marathon races at the 2019 Spinks Run Fest. So we know that 943 runners participated in these races, 484 men participated, 212 runners ran the marathon, and 142 men ran the marathon. We're going to take this partial information and build a complete two-way table. For the two categorical variables, one is gender, and those are going to form the rows, and the other is race type, marathon or half marathon, and those will be in the columns. So we're going to build a two-way table for those two categorical variables. So we first want to build the table. So make a complete two-way table for all the counts for the categories gender and race type, and then answer two follow-up questions. What proportion of the participants are female, and what proportion of the females ran the marathon? Now, to aid us in doing this, I've set up an Excel spreadsheet. That way I can show you how to do this on the screen here. This is very easy to do just on a whiteboard or on a piece of paper. Nothing terribly fancy about this. It's just simple to do on the screen this way. Now, we have to understand that our information is really coming in two types. We've got information about the totals. So, for example, the total number of people that ran the half marathon will go into this cell. The total number of female participants will go into this cell. And these four inner cells, and this is usually where most of the work is, we have to discover things like how many females ran the half marathon, how many males ran the full marathon. Okay, so the information in this two-way table really is coming in two different types. We've got this two-way information here, and then we've got our totals on the sides. I usually think of this side information here, the stuff in yellow, as marginal information. So that's kind of marginal data, and the things that are within this in these four inner cells usually have to work a little bit to get that information extracted. Okay, let's take a look at how we can fill this in. We've got 943 runners participating in these races, and that's going to go into this total cell here. This is going to count the total number of participants at all in this race. We know that 484 men participated, so that will go here. We have 484 men that participated. Now, in effect, we do know how to get the value of this cell, therefore, right? Because the 943 are partitioned into two categories, the male and the female. So the females have to make up the complement, right? So I can get that cell value just by taking this cell value minus this cell value. And so there are 459 females that ran in some race in the Spinks Run Fest in 2019. Okay, let's keep going. We know that 212 runners ran the marathon. So the full marathon had 212 runners. And again, by the partition principle, whatever is in this cell has to complement the 212. So I can simply take the 943 and subtract the 212 and discover that there were 731 runners in the half marathon. Now, if we didn't have any more information to work with, there would be no way to finish filling in these four cells because, in fact, there's not a unique way to fill in these four cells just based on this marginal information. There would be any number of coherent ways to fill in those four cells. But we do have one extra piece of information, and this is the thing that breaks it open for us. We know that 142 men ran the marathon. So in the male category and the full marathon category, we know that there are 142 men in the male and full marathon category. So we know that cell. And again, once we know the value of that cell by the partition principle, we know that this cell has to be the 484 minus the 142 or the 342. Okay, again, this cell here that I've got highlighted, these are the females that ran the half marathon. I can get that by the partition principle. That's going to be the 731 minus the 342. That's a total of 389. And the 212 minus the 142 should give me the number of females that ran the full marathon. What's interesting to note here, at least in the 2019 Spinks Run Fest, we see that the full marathon had 212 runners, but we know that roughly 2/3 of them, right? 2/3 of them were men and only 1/3 were women, whereas in the half marathon, it's actually slightly more women than men running the half marathon. Okay, but that's what we have available to us in this summary. Now, let's go ahead and take a look at questions 2 and 3. What proportion of females participated? What proportion of participants are females? Okay, so here are the participants, the 943. What proportion of them are females? Well, that's the 459. So if we're going to do a little side calculation here, we're going to take the 459 females and divide that by the total number of participants. And we see that about 0.486, about 0.49, roughly 49% of the participants are female. Okay, so those are the female participants. Another question is, what proportion of the females ran the marathon? What proportion of the females ran the marathon? So our denominator is going to be the females. That's the 459. And we want to know, of the females, what proportion ran the full marathon. So we're going to take the 70 as our numerator and the 459 females as our denominator. And so the answer to that question is about 0.1525. So about 15% of the females ran the full marathon. Okay, not surprising based on what we're seeing in that two-way table. All right, so that brings an end to section 2.1. Remember, briefly, just to kind of recap the things that we did, we started by looking at counts and proportions, just working with a single categorical variable and understanding that the counts and the proportions are kind of the principal thing that we're looking at when we're working with a categorical variable. And we saw that bar charts were a helpful way of displaying that information graphically. And then we went into working with two categorical variables, and we saw how two-way tables are a helpful way of summarizing the counts and the proportions therein. Okay, so we'll meet again. Our next video lecture will be on section 2.2, so I'll see you at that video lecture. Take care. Until then, bye-bye.